Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis Affamie History Podcast with your host, Wendy Aris. Today on the podcast, we're honored to welcome Ms. Joanna Diaz, a dedicated genealogist who has spent decades researching her Puerto Rican family tree. Her passion for uncovering ancestral roots has led her on a journey through centuries of records, stories, and connections, both personal and historical. Recognizing the challenges that often come with tracing Caribbean heritage, Joanna took her research a step further by creating an online resource to assist others in navigating the complexities of Puerto Rican genealogy. Her website has become a go-to platform for individuals and families seeking to reconnect with their Puerto Rican roots, offering guidance, tools, and encouragement. Whether you're just beginning your journey or deep into your research, Joanna's experience and insights are sure to inspire. Get ready to learn about the rich tapestry of Puerto Rican history, the power of persistence in genealogical research, and how one person's passion can empower a community. So settle in, and let's get into the conversation.
I wanted to thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, and to speak about your quest into genealogy, most recently into Puerto Rican genealogy. And before we start, can I just have you briefly introduce yourself?
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Joanna Diaz. I'm an educator in Philadelphia. So I think, well, I'm the daughter of a librarian. So I think the idea of research and learning and sharing is just sort of part of my DNA. I got a master's in bilingual bicultural studies. I think is probably like a precursor of just thinking about like living in two languages and understanding the Puerto Rican community in my own city that I live in. And I did get, over the pandemic, I used my time wisely, and I got a research certificate in genealogy. And that was really like a passion project for me to finally like have, the steps and doing it like a professional genealogist instead of just, learning on the go as I had been for 30 years. So that was really a fun experience.
No, thank you so much for that. And yes, I can definitely relate in terms of just learning on the go when it comes to researching your family tree. So would you share our guest, what was your why for researching your family history?
So my why, I think, is, a few things. One, living in the diaspora of a community, of a small place. I lived in a big city with a lot of people who had family that also lived in that big city. And so there were these generations of people, and I would meet grandparents and aunts and uncles. And my parents lived here really without family. We had some extended family, but they weren't my immediate family. So I spent summers going back to the island and feeling a little bit of an outsider and sort of confused with these really large families. So I spent time observing and looking, and then in the off season when we were home in the States, I would ask my mom, who was who or whatever, and I would study it and try to remember so that when I went back, and then I would have a list of questions, because at that point, by the time I got back and I had paid attention to who people were, I wanted to know, well, who were they then also related to? And so I would make little connections, and my dad would always have those college, yellow pads, and I would, write everything down and then take it home and study. And so it sort of became, just became my practice of getting ready to go to the island and then coming home. Also as an only child. So it was entertainment there, I think. And yeah, and so I think it started as a kid and curiosity, and you always had like those older folks that were excited to share that information. And so I think I sort of saw like the value of being able to connect with those older folks that were excited and they were like, I had an audience. And so I loved giving them attention because I was getting something out of it and they were getting something out of it, that connection with the older generation. And then, like as technology got more advanced, all of a sudden the world came to me. And that was pretty exciting. And I think also in Puerto Rico, it's difficult. Like history is difficult to find, at least the type of history that I was looking for. And so really it was family stories was sort of how you were gonna find out about how things used to be.
Yes, exactly, exactly. No, thank you. And then of course, then this leads into my next question of, what inspired or motivated you to then create the Puerto Rican genealogy website?
I think that came out of that technological piece. It was the idea that I remember the first thing that came out were these discs. It's like
Yeah.
CD discs from ancestry.com. And I think it was like Social Security Death Index. I mean, something just so basic. But all of a sudden, it was this idea that I didn't have to go into a library to find things, especially in a place that my local library wasn't going to have the information that I was looking for. And the libraries in Puerto Rico weren't going to have necessarily what it was that I was looking for. They weren't as sophisticated as some of the libraries here. So for me, there was a gap. And all of a sudden getting this technology was opened, a world to me to then be able to have data system to like put that information in and keep it not on just sheets of paper. And then I realized as I got older, you have conversations and other people are also curious. And they go, but where am I going to start? And in my head, I'm thinking, well, I've done this for so long. It's just sort of like part of, my shtick. And other people were sort of feeling a little lost of where to start, how to find information. And three, if they didn't have the Spanish language, it intimidated them to think that they could even do the research. So the more, indexing that happened and the more things that came online, I realized that I had the ability, and I think, like as I was talking about, like my interest in bicultural studies was how do I make this accessible to people who feel like they can't, right? Well, I can explain how these documents, work. They're systematized. So once you kind of learn the system and you know those words, you can then apply that to other documents. And the advent of the internet just seems like a perfect place to be able to like disseminate that information for people who are searching for it.
No, definitely. Thank you for doing so. But I guess now we'll just go through your website. So this is just for, people coming onto your website, which I'll put in the show notes, the link as to how they should navigate. What would be the best in terms of navigating your site?
Yeah. So we start off on the homepage. And I just have a little bit of a background of actually kind of a little bit of, sort of what we talked about. I try to keep some information on some of the new pieces that I'm adding. I mean, I think that's one of the things about when you are used, if you want a website to, continue to be useful instead of just sort of like a one time, I think it's important for people to know sort of like what's new, what's come up. It starts off with the genealogy research, and that's just sort of for like the basic person. Like, how do I even get started? Where do I go? Where do I put information? There's lots of different sites out there. Unfortunately, I feel like they're consolidating a little bit, so there's kind of less. And so one of the platforms that I have used consistently is ancestry.com. I find it really user friendly. So I have, some photos and some information on like what it is that you should be looking for over time when you are doing a lot of research. Of course, you know how to use all the new little buttons, which sometimes can be overwhelming to people when they get onto something new. There's sometimes it feels overwhelming with too many options. So I try to break it down for people to see sort of like, the benefits, of the different sites. I list, like the document resources that people can go through. I know, and for my own family, which ones have been the most useful, but for other people, there's different ones that are actually useful for them. So I put links in order to get there. So it just kind of like shows a little bit of that information. And then you'll see here at the bottom, I actually have a few shows, genealogy shows that have come over time, and I put some of the Puerto Rican celebrities that have been interviewed. I actually one of the people in the interview, the video, I actually got a chance to meet her last year. So there's a picture of me. It's a terrible picture because I'm crying. Meeting her was so exciting. But Justina Machado, who was in that clip, I actually got to meet her after a performance that she did at Harvard last year. So it was really very cool. So yeah. So and that's my grandmother at the bottom there. So I try to put in some like personal pictures, that I have of people, in the family. Yeah.
And then I know
So
you mentioned about surnames.
surnames. So surnames is actually the one that I think people gravitate to the most. It's something that's so personal. It's something that you say and use every single day, right? Is your surname. And in Puerto Rico, we have a very distinct way of using surnames.
Mhm.
So women, when they get married, you do not lose their surname. So they keep their surnames first of their father, then of their mother, with no hyphen usually. And then sometimes what they would do is add the word de, which means of, and then put their husband's last name. So there are times when you might be looking at a census record or something else, and there's 3 last names, which in many ways can be a mouthful, but as a genealogist can be very helpful because you're A, sure that it's the person, and B, you can follow, family lines and stuff and like previous marriages and stuff. So when the more information, the better. And so surnames are also what a lot of people don't realize is surnames in Puerto Rico coming from the ones that come from Spain and Portugal really give actually a lot of information about the origin in that country. So I have no family records of anyone actually coming on a boat from anywhere other than Puerto Rico. So I have family, the roots that I've gotten into is to the 1700s. So I can't find anyone over there. However, hidden in all the surnames, you can find by looking at the spelling to know what region of Spain it might have come from, or Portugal, or somewhere else. You can also find, once you start looking in that and you realize like, that's actually like a French word, or that's an Italian word, or, wherever, you can then look into that and then realize it's a town, it's a place. And so it's not going to give you necessarily a paper trail, but it's going to give you some sort of like point of origin. And so I think that's something that attracts a lot of people to just feeling some kind of connection before you even get to that paper trail.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, just what you said in terms of the last name, giving you hints into other areas of where that may be. So I don't know if we want to go to just to briefly go over, I guess, the ancestry records.
Yeah. So so this is the page that I was referring to. So if you don't speak Spanish, how is it that you can actually get information from these records? One of the things that I do feel aggravated, I think sometimes in my research, is very often these companies don't hire native Spanish speakers to do their indexing. So it can be very difficult to find information. So that's something that people do need to keep in mind as they're doing this information, is keeping it as broad your search as possible, understanding that sometimes when people don't have any frame of reference, when they're looking through handwritten documents, they're making up what they think those letters might be, but if they have no frame of reference of the language, sometimes it's absolutely absurd. And so you can actually miss, good records. So it's good to kind of put in different spellings. But you'll see here, I kind of show these old records. As they get into the 1900s, they get more, they're typed and they're not as difficult to read. But the ones that are coming from the 1800s, they are beautiful handwriting, sometimes difficult to read. And there's a lot of information actually in Puerto Rican records they had in the 1800s on a birth record, which is the acta de nacimiento right there. Very often they had grandparents listed. So it's so much information can be taken from a birth record. Yeah, unlike today.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I know what you mean when these, how it's written, it looks very artistic, very nice. But again, the language is different, especially with Old English. A lot of the letters and the words are slightly different. where an S may be actually a C type of thing.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, what am I reading here? I don't understand. It appears to be English, but I don't understand. And just what you're saying, reading all of this in Spanish can be a challenge if you're not familiar with everything. And I guess that's the same thing here with this particular marriage record as well.
Marriage records, yeah. And so some of them really gave a lot of it's funny because it gives a lot of clues, right? So it'll let you know if they were previously married. It gives you the name of witnesses, so they may have been neighbors. So sometimes these little pieces in a document can actually give you a ton of information.
Definitely. Okay. And then, of course, just your personal stuff in here where it gets more standardized. You're able to see and, yeah, provide some information. I think you'll sometimes have the parents in here. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then, of course, just your personal relations as well in there. And then, of course, yes, the World War I or World War II draft cards. I've used them a lot.
Yeah, and then and the fun thing about them, I mean, as sad as it was, is that they give a physical description. And that's always a really nice little piece. And especially in Puerto Rico, the it really depended on who was writing that out and how they would describe color. A lot of people don't think about color in Puerto Rico and how there were like distinctions of shades or whatever. And so you can find really sort of odd things as you look through these.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, especially here, just gives it more standardized by World War II in terms of the complexion indicated here. Very nice. And then I guess we'll just go to you had some historical resources because that's always good in terms of context when you're researching.
Yeah. So right here we have I start off with some videos that are just giving some background. So especially if you're sort of, at this point, if you have family that came in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, you may be a couple generations in.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't have family like I did, always going back there, you might have some distance. So I think understanding the place is going to help give you some context into to knowing how to research and what to look for. So I have some literature, some nonfiction, some fiction, and then maps. I'm a map kid. I always loved maps as I was growing up looking at maps. So I have a bunch of different maps there, and just it's interesting to sort of see how it changed from the 1500s
Exactly.
to now.
Mm-hmm.
And then she was a researcher. Her name is Estelle Lubriel Descifre or Descifre Lubriel. I'm not sure if I'm saying it the right way. It's been a little bit since I've had to say her name. And she did a research on the island. I mean, and this was like an in person, which is like so amazing to think about that, she actually kind of like went from town to town looking at different populations and where they came from to Puerto Rico. So looking at the immigration to Puerto Rico from different places in Spain, mostly like the Iberian Peninsula, but also the like Venezuela and surrounding islands. And so it's really just rich, rich, rich. So she lists people almost like a census, and she lists them like with their job and their age and like where they came from. But also there's some maps in there. And unfortunately, they are like prized books. And so you can find them at the University of Puerto Rico. I think that they are at the Library of Congress in the library, I think in Maryland. And there's a few other places that has like one or two books. I have seen them at the archives in Puerto Rico. So not all of them, not all of them. So it's really just, and they're not for lending. So you have to like research them while you're there, but really good sources of information. Yeah. And so then I've had a couple of other things that I have found via like text online. Google Books is a really great place to find old texts, things that have been scanned that are now available for free. And so I've made a couple of charts showing where people have come from. And that also ties into your last name. So sometimes people have, German last names or French last names, British last names, they just sound, like white American. And you're just like, where could that have come from? And so it's important then to know that people came from other islands, depending on what was going on in history, whether they came from the, Dominican Republic or Venezuela or Haiti, because they were fleeing, something else, or St. Croix or, other places. And so A lot of people don't realize, like Roberto Clemente, actually, he had his mother's last name was an English last name. And of course, it is because I'm 48. I have brain fog, and the word Walker flew out of my head. And so you think to yourself, like Walker, but when people were coming from other islands, especially if they had been, come from, were enslaved, they got the name of, the owner. And so it's just interesting. A lot of people don't really think about how those names are totally normal when you are on the island.
Yep. No, definitely. And it's just fascinating to see and of course to know these resources are there, and where you can be able to access them from. So I don't know if we wanted to go through, I guess just the migration pattern just a little bit, before moving off.
So this has a little bit of looking at some of the big places of the diaspora in the United States. There's another page that I have on there that I just added recently, actually, but it has music. And so you'll see I have a little video right there. There are some songs. A lot of the history of the island sort of comes through music, through songs. And there's a few that are just the favorites that you hear played over and over again. And they talk of the migration. I mean, it's a sense of loss of people having to, whether it was from the Great Depression or just Operation Bootstrap, where people sort of ended up in the United States and always lamenting, that they had to leave and that they couldn't go back. And so New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, now Orlando, like the Florida area are sort of the big spaces that the diaspora are in. Ooh, I'll have to fix that video. And so really great, people have come out of the diaspora that are still connected, to the island and are bringing the culture and the language and their roots, to the forefront and keeping the culture alive, even though we're in a different space. And I think, it enriches, right, the experience of people because Puerto Ricans, for the most part, have what we call a circular migration. So
Hmm.
unlike other immigrant communities that leave, for famine, for warfare, just for better opportunities, and don't have the ability to go home, come to the United States, and they sort of become part of the American experience. But as Puerto Ricans, we have the ability to go back and forth. And so very often we do, whether it's for retirement, whether it's to visit family, whether it's we just own land. And so we in Puerto Rico constantly influence the culture here in the United States. And then the people in the United States sort of give back to the culture on the island. And so it's a very unique, I think, experience among a cultural group in the United States. Yeah.
Perfect. No, no, thank you so much for that. As I said, I'll make sure that this is in the show notes so people can be able to go on your site and take it as they can as a reference for their research. And I guess in additionally, like what other kinds of tools or guides that have been most helpful, I guess, to some of your people that have used your site for the Puerto Rican family history research.
So one of the things that is really interesting that people feel sometimes stuck
Mm.
is that a lot of Puerto Ricans have nicknames. And unlike in the United, so they have two sets of nicknames that are just generic, right? Like Tito, Tita, it's kind of like a thing, and it's not going to give you any information on the name. Other times they're common nicknames, but if you don't realize that, right? Especially if they don't sound necessarily like the original name, such as Peggy for Margaret. That's sort of an odd, how on earth did those two things kind of come together, right? Or Bobby for
Mm.
Robert. And so in Spanish, there's also those nicknames, and sometimes people don't even realize. So people feel nervous or sort of stuck of like, how do I figure out what this person's real name is? Or sometimes they don't even realize that it isn't a name. I remember the first time I realized I knew my dad was a junior, but my grandfather was called Moncho. And so it didn't occur to me. I'm like, and then once you get to that age, maybe I was like 7, and I was like, his name is Ramon. Moncho. And then all of a sudden, when I would hear like a cha or something like at the end, I can't even think off the top of my head, then I realized, oh, that must be a nickname to something else. And so I started kind of putting those things together, and then I wrote them down. And actually, on the site, there's a page that has nicknames, so that if you hear a nickname, you can then know, okay, I'm not going to find necessarily this name, but I'm going to go searching for this other thing, right? Names like Maribel. A lot of people now people will spell that as an actual name,
Mhm.
but long ago it was Maria Isabel, right? Or Marilyn, Marilyn was Maria Linda. So it's important to kind of know those. Paquito was Francisco, right? A lot of people aren't going to make those connections. And so people feel stuck. They're looking, Paquito, Paquito. Well, they're not going to be in a census or on a birth certificate with a nickname.
Mm.
So it's those kinds of things are sort of important. And the other is that on the islands, it's important to know the differences in municipalities, right? And a lot of places have the same names. So if you only have a little piece of information, and I think I use it as an example on the site, you hear Rincon. Well, I know my grandmother lived in Rincon, but she lived in Rincon in Sidra, so it was an area in a town in the middle of the island. There's another Rincon, which is the big town on the western side of the island. So if I don't realize that, right, and I'm only looking for one Rincon, I'm going to hit a brick wall because I'm going to be looking at that place in the western part of the island. So I did create a page that had the names of like the sectors, is what they call the sectores, inside the municipalities, so that I can realize, if I'm not finding something here, wow, this same name is actually going to be found in these other places. And so I think sometimes people get stuck because they don't realize that there's other options of places to look.
No, definitely, absolutely. And I guess part of that, would be part of the challenge. What are some of the key challenges that, for you've uncovered when researching Puerto Rican ancestry?
Hmm. I feel like at this point, I almost forget all the places that I hit because I've nicely gotten so far. I think a couple of times I hit names that they took the mother's name because the parents were married, or I mean, I wasn't there, so I don't know what the reason was.
Mm.
But the mother was the one that passed the name on. So there have been times where I've been searching for something and I'm looking for a father, and then it took a little while for me to realize, oh, father wasn't in the picture, the child got the mother's name. And that was something actually that they put on birth certificates. It took me a little bit to realize that. So in Puerto Rico, they will put, if your parents were not married or considered married, because there's also ambiguity there, they would put like hijo or hija, right? Child of natural. They would say natural daughter. So that was an indicator that they were not legitimate, right? And also, if you were legitimate, your parents were married, it would say legitimate.
Yes.
It was like really calling people out. But if you're not paying attention to that, and I wasn't at first, I was just sort of like skipping over that and looking for the names. I wasn't reading the document in its entirety. Once I made that key connection, I was like, oh, read it in its entirety. It's there for a reason. And so when I would see natural, I would say, okay, maybe this last name is only coming from the mother. You find also that people sometimes played around with their names. I have great great grandparents that were not married, but they were considered, you'll see, contrato consensual, right? So they were like in a kind of like common law. Well, there were times, I guess, when the guy was in the home, and then there was times when he wasn't. And so you see the last names switch order. And so my family actually, we are known as the Felicianos, but if we had taken his last name, it would have been Garcia. And so then it's interesting because in the records, when you look at the family, like the children, there was like a ton of them. Some of them picked Garcia Feliciano and others did Feliciano Garcia. So it's interesting. I don't know if it was like the relationship with the parents and why they decided which one they were going to take. So before records were the way that they are now, where you have a driver's license and everything is, in print, back in the day in rural places, you were able to sort of decide, what your name was going to be depending on the space that you were in.
Definitely true. What you mentioned in terms of especially people's names changing, it was one thing one way and then changed later on, and trying to connect them can be sometimes a challenge. And, how do how do with the colonial records, the language differences, or migration patterns, how does that all impact the genealogical research process?
I think, I think it's important when one is doing that research to kind of keep all possibilities open. I think very often we hear stories,
Yes.
or we have these belief systems that, okay, my people came from here and they did this and whatever. And I think it's when you're really doing that genealogy, it's important to just slow down and realize that stories that you might have been told may have been to like elevate status or just, like whisper down the lane, like things just sort of like get said wrong, or people made some sort of assumption and then it just became truth, quote unquote. And so it's really important to sort of do the research and realize that there may be a possibility that you hadn't necessarily thought of. And so in Puerto Rico, a lot of last names, right? You say it with like a Spanish accent, right? Because people speak Spanish. What some people don't realize is a lot of names are actually French in origin and they're Italian. And that's because there was a big migration of people from Corsica, right? Which was, or is, it's an island that had the original inhabitants had come from Italy. It had been belonged to Italy for a really long time. It's an island, in the Mediterranean. And then in the 1800s, it was taken over by France, right? So you're going to have different surnames depending on where where the ancestors came from. When those people came to Puerto Rico, right after 1815, because of a declaration that Spain created, because of all of the independent, all the Latin American countries were like, see you, Spain. They wanted to get away from the Spanish crown, right? They were losing all their territory. So they decided that they were going to put out a decree to Catholic countries because they thought, since Spain was such a Catholic country, that if you had a bunch of Catholics go to this place, that they would have an allegiance to, I guess, Catholicism that would be over allegiance for independence. I don't know. It's kind of a crazy thought.
Yeah.
And so they opened it up and a whole bunch of Corsicans, things weren't going well. So over there, and they were just like, bet, let's go over. So they ended up in Puerto Rico because you would get 5 hectares, right? Which is like, I think a little bit bigger than acres of free land, right? Like Puerto Rico wasn't that populated. So all these people came over and were you created basically the coffee industry on the island. So over generations, those names that were French or Italian in origin were said now in a Spanish accent. So you're saying it and you're assuming that it's Spanish and in fact it's not Spanish at all. So I think that has been like an awakening for a couple, for some people. But if you don't have that historical context of those migration patterns, you have absolutely no idea. You're thinking like, I kind of got this weird last name. It's like a random D in there or something. It's not Spanish, and that's what it is. And so there's such a variation also in genes, like little, physical appearance of Puerto Ricans. And so I think when you see like these random like blue eyes or red hair, it's a curiosity, right? And but it's just DNA that's being passed from some other space. And so I think it's knowing the area on the islands, right? Like figuring out what area was the family in, and then thinking, wow, who immigrated to that space, and then you may be doing your DNA, right? Looking at records, understanding that there were misspellings, like even in English, standardization, of language really didn't come, I know, in the United States for a while. Even if you look at something in the early 1900s, you'll see that the spelling is different. And the same thing goes for Spain. They had different people in different parts of the peninsula that spoke Gallego, Catalan, like different languages. So when they come to Puerto Rico, they're trying to figure out their own standardization of like, what is this Spanish, I guess, that we're using? And so people might put vowels differently. And you have a certain amount of people that are literate versus, I mean, everybody can speak. So people are speaking and people are writing things down maybe phonetically, right, according to their accent and stuff. So it's important to sort of realize that Puerto Rico was literally that melting pot of people from lots of different places sort of creating what we now know as Puerto Rican culture from people coming from kind of all over the world.
No, definitely. And Joanna, have you used DNA testing in your own research? And if you have, has it added or challenged your findings?
So yeah, we have. It's exciting. We did my grandmother who recently passed away. We did hers, my mother and her sister, and then I did it, and then my children. So that was for us to sort of just follow one line of people and to sort of see how you don't necessarily need the other person, right? You don't need the other parent because you're able to sort of like sift through that when you have a line of four generations like that. That's was really very cool. And the funny thing is about Puerto Rican DNA is that it's you're talking about a small place, so DNA is sort of like shifting among the same people over generations that all have similar DNA. So it was interesting then when my kids did theirs because on some level you're like, goodness, this DNA all looks like very similar. But when my kids did it, who are half Irish, all of a sudden you were able to really see how, DNA splits or whatever. So that was interesting to just sort of like make sure that it was correct, that it was like sort of doing it right. We did find Basque, which was interesting. We had always suspected that there might be Basque because my mother is Rh negative, and when she was pregnant with me, she actually had to like get a shot because I was positive and she was negative, and there can be some danger to the mother when that happens and to the baby. And Basque people have the highest amount of percentage of Rh negative. And so we sort of always suspected that. So I think a professor of hers had mentioned that when she was in grad school. And so when we did the DNA, we were like, okay. And that was like exciting, that came out. We also were surprised to not, I wouldn't say surprised, but we found that there was Jewish DNA. And, you on a, like historical level, you're like, okay, so, the Spanish government was getting rid, right, of all the people that they didn't want to be over there. So those populations were the ones hopping on boats, like, let's get out of town. So it's you know that, but when you see it on paper, you're like, okay, like we were like getting away from that crazy lady over there. So that kind of stuff is really, exciting because it's things that you sort of think, but like to really see it on paper. And then of course, you as Puerto Ricans, we know that we have African origins, but those historical records are really also difficult, to find. And so when we came up with that, and you see Senegal and Nigeria, you're just like, all right, like we know it's there. And so it's this idea that that you're a mix. It's like you kind of grow up knowing that, but when you get it on paper, I don't know, there's just like a legitimacy, I guess. That's exciting. And then I did an mtDNA, which is a mitochondrial. It took me many years to do it because it's a little more expensive. And I was like, do I really need to? And it just follows the mother's line. And I have a lot of blue eyes on that line. And so I don't know, I was a little nervous about where that was going to go. But when I got it back and it had us led back to a Taína, an indigenous woman, there was just I don't know, there was just like a pride, in that, like knowing that, the mother of my mother of my mother of my mother was an indigenous one. I don't know. It was just really like humbling, and it gave us, I think, like a rootedness to like literally like the earth there. It's kind of hard to explain. That was definitely really cool. I know some people are like weird about DNA, and if you're not into it, that's okay. But for our family and just the connections that we've made with people who were looking to connect, I've met a few cousins that, didn't know their origins and were able to connect to me. And that's a really wonderful feeling to be able to like give them information, especially because there's a tree where they had no information. And now all of a sudden they have a whole tree has been really awesome, and making connections with family.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And with DNA, it can't be a Pandora's box, however you want to see it, whether it's a glass half full, half empty, but it is those connections. And of course, it does give you a sense of centeredness and a wholeness once
Mhm.
you get back those results. So, and I
Yeah.
know, Joanna, your work, beautifully ties in both history and genealogy. Why do you believe it's important to connect the two, especially in the Puerto Rican context?
I think it goes back to something I mentioned a little while ago, is that, Puerto Rican culture is actually very new when you look about it. I mean, the United States itself is very new when you think about it, when especially like if you've had a chance to travel overseas and you see these places with these ancient cultures and they've been there for generations and generations, and the history just, is mind-blowing. Puerto Rico's very, very new in the history, of civilizations, and it was really, people coming together, right? Forced, some not, and it was a culture that didn't exist, right? You had the indigenous peoples who had their own culture, then all of a sudden these foreigners come in from, overseas, right? Places in Europe, and they're these 2 groups meeting, right? And then you have the people forced to the island, right? So then there's these 3 cultural groups meeting, and they created something that didn't exist before that, right? Puerto Rican culture only exists from the mixing of all the people who ended up on this tiny little island smaller than the state of Connecticut. And while there are similarities to other Latin American, places or whatever, it's unique and it's in its own, the music that was like birthed out of that, food that was birthed out of that, poetry and dance and just the animals that are indigenous, to that place, like the coqui and little things like that. Like there's something really, I don't know, gorgeous, I think, about the newness of it. And I think knowing that
Mhm.
is tied up with the genealogy, right? Because it's those people, like, they're the living people that were the, I don't wanna say drivers, I don't know if that's the right word, but the contributors, right? Like, their relationships with each other of survival and of leisure, right? Like, to create all these things that are what we now hold dear, as our culture, were being created mostly in the 1800s. If when you look at history, right? The island wasn't that populated before then. And so really it was like this, 2 centuries ago, all of a sudden all these people came together and like now we inherited this like beautiful thing. So it's wonderful to, go overseas and see these places that have been there for thousands of years, but there's something really, I think, cool about something that's sort of new. Yeah.
Mhm. No, definitely, absolutely. And then, of course, what kind of feedback have you received from others who've used your site? Have there been any stories that stood out to you?
Yeah, I've had a bunch. I've had, just like some thank yous, right? Of just like, "Oh my gosh, like I wanted to get started and I didn't know where to, what to do, and I found this site and like now I feel like comfortable and I've started my tree." And so people will give me a little bit of insight, into the trees that they started. Other people have sent just like the story, right, of the migration, they just tell me sort of their family story, which is really nice. And some people have sent really peculiar names, right? Like real specific. And they're like, I've done all this research and I'm just, like hitting a brick wall. And I love those. I love those puzzles. And so, then I'll have like this correspondence with like someone, I've never met. And we're researching this name and we go back and forth, trying to, there's still a few that I haven't been able to cut through. I've had a few people connect with me about Hawaii. So they're part of the Puerto Rican diaspora in Hawaii, which is really beautiful when they tell me, their stories and stuff. And so I'm actually have been working on something to sort of, help tell that story. So that's been really awesome because they know, of course, they're the ones that are the historians of that culture. That's been really nice. And I think the ones that touch me the most are the ones that are people who are trying to connect. The ones that are like half, let's say half or a quarter Puerto Rican, where there's just like a piece of their pie, and they're trying to connect, right? Where they're like, I just found out I'm Puerto Rican, or, you know, I just, learned who my, a parent was, or I'm adopted, or, those are the stories that really, I think, have touched me the most, because it's someone with us, like, the desire is more than just like a passing interest. It's a sense of like rootedness and connection and stuff. And so those stories have been the ones that really touch me. And I just, I can, I can do this. I can do something. Yeah, somebody can pay me to do something or whatever. But those are the ones that I want to help. I just want to help. So yeah, those I love that. And it's just, and it's, I'm a stranger and people are sharing the stories with me. And I think there's something beautiful about that, because sometimes they're doing it really alone. They're not telling anyone else, but they're sharing that with me. And so it's like almost like I have a secret about people and I'm helping them, make the breakthrough. Yeah.
Yeah. No, definitely. Those are, they're just showing their vulnerability at that time, and here you are being able to receive it. So, which
Mhm.
is cool. And so, as we come to an end to this episode, Joanna, what message would you like to leave the listeners with, especially those beginning their Puerto Rican family history journey?
I would say, don't be afraid. Don't let the language intimidate you. There's sites like mine. There's, and ways to like reach out. And now, like with all the amazing like Google tools and stuff, they get more sophisticated. There's ways to kind of like go through those language barriers. I think taking a trip to the islands there's nothing like that. There's nothing like, even if you can't go to the particular town, like just kind of like getting on the island and connecting with those roots, I think brings it to life, in a way that a document, doesn't. And I think reading the books, that's the thing about Puerto Rico, is that a lot of the history books that exist don't tell. I mean, I think everywhere, right? Like history books don't really tell the story of the common person,
Mhm.
right? History books, were told by the victors, and it's like military battles and all that kind of stuff. And like, no, I don't think anybody really cares about that. It's the nitty gritty of the everyday life that I know is of interest, to me. And I say this as a social studies teacher. And so I think for me, I've been able to get the most insight through literature, right? And so like the taste of sugar, which was actually, it starts off on the island and ends up in Hawaii. Conquistadora, which is, talks of a person trying to make it, coming over from Spain and trying to make it in on the island. Those stories, and I mean there's a ton of like Hibaro, that sort of give you a little bit of insight into what the creation, I guess, of the culture is. And I think those are the things that kind of like help flesh out the names that are just sitting, in a document, right there. And I think not being afraid to reach out to people, if you have a subscription to something, people post pictures. I think that people post pictures because they want to connect. And so they may not check very often, but I think it's worth, if you have a question, putting a little comment on something that somebody shared, on one of the ancestry sites. It may be a while before they answer, but I think that, again, people share because they want to and they want to be asked. And don't get discouraged when people don't respond. There's always someone else, and have fun with it. I think, ultimately, you know, connection might not be necessarily with the names or the people that are there, but it might be with other genealogies, enthusiasts. And so I think, just you having fun and meeting people, and I think also going and doing the research in person is really, if you ever get a chance, I mean, not that many people are like showing up in Utah, but if you live near DC or New York, right, getting into a library, or if you get to go to Puerto Rico, that's also just really a lot of fun. Even if you don't get a lot of information, it's kind of fun to like get in there and sort of do that stuff. So, and then definitely check out my website. I'm always happy to answer, emails and point people in the right direction.
Oh, thank you so much, Joanna. This has been so fascinating and so much fun to discuss. I'm sure we could have talked for a couple more hours about it. But But no, this has been fantastic, and I'm sure that people will be able to get what they need from your site in terms of what they're researched. So thank you so much for all that you do.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.